members Sabella Santabru, Austin Higgins, and through technology we have Matt Cole and Lynn Eichhold joining us. We have a full complement of 5 members. We have a couple of things to do before we get to our continuation. First, you should all have received minutes. Oh, also with us, I think out there is our recording secretary, Jen Higgins. I can see her. I don't see the building commissioner yet, but Jen Higgins is also with us. And so we have 3 items for consideration. We have the minutes of the meeting of April 16th. You all should have received those minutes. Are there any questions or comments or suggestions or changes for those minutes? Hearing none, do we hear a motion for their approval? Austin, thank you.
Motion to approve.
Second. Thank you, Sabelle. All in favor of approving the minutes, say aye. Thank you all.
Aye.
Okay, you should also have received on short notice, I apologize, the decision for case number 2025-06, the trustees of the Higgins Realty Trust at 43 Kenneth Lane. If you've had a chance to review it, do you have any questions or comments or suggestions for changes? Hearing none, we don't need to vote on that, we'll just accept that as approved. Thank you all. Now, for our business tonight, we have the continuation of the hearing of case 2025-04, Jacoby at 13 and 14 Harris Road. Before we begin our discussion, I need to report on a very productive, informative and productive conversation I had with the town council. As you may recall, when we last met, our thinking was that we wanted to uphold the commissioner's ruling because we thought it was an accurate interpretation of the bylaw. But at the same time, we wanted a different outcome. We thought that we should approve the pool, that it was be hard to understand not approving a pool for someone living in as these houses were situated, with one owner owning 2 lots, and Mrs. Zender had given us 27 examples of other people living with houses with accessory dwellings in an adjoining owned lot, and then 3 of those were in a period of time since the adoption of the bylaw. So that's how we left. We left, I think, in my mind, we left was, do we have the authority to do that? To try to modify, I was thinking of it, I can only speak for myself, you never know there's never a meeting of the minds. You have a mutuality of assent, but there's never a meeting of the minds. So what I thought was that we wanted to, under the guise of modifying the commissioner's ruling, allow the pool. Town council explained that really we could do that, but it would be an overturning of the building commissioner's decision, and it would be precedential to the point that it would therefore establish that anyone else in a like circumstance with a house adjoining an owned lot could build an accessory building. It would have that precedential impact, no matter how we conditioned it. And we also had the ability to condition it, he thought. It would be a curious filing at the Registry of Deeds, but be that as it may.
Sorry, could you explain the condition that we would set would become precedential, or the overturning?
No, the overturning.
Which would mean, so maybe I'm mixing up. So by us overturning, we are saying that what David said is incorrect.
Yeah.
Just fully incorrect. There's no modification that is incorrect. At that point, what conditions would we be able to impose?
Well, yeah, we didn't get to that issue. What he suggested is we proceed, we hold the vote on the commissioner's ruling in abeyance while we ask council to give a case for a variance. He thought that in his reading of it there was colorable argument for a variance, and that a variance is a cleaner and easier way to do it. It's not precedential in the sense that a variance is almost always sui generis. And that with a variance we could attach any conditions we'd like. Okay. So what I suggest we do, depending on your wishes, is that we put aside for a moment the discussion we had last time, and then hear Mr. Zender out on the grounds for granting a variance, and then see where we are at that point. Is that agreeable to everybody?
Yes.
Yeah? All right. Mr. Zender, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody on the screen as well. So, first of all, I'd like to start with just a brief note on the bylaw itself, which is that your bylaw at section 16443 sets forth the Board of Appeals powers.
Right.
And under 16443B, 2, under variances, it says, it is the power to hear and decide appeals or petitions for variances from the terms of this chapter, including variances for use with respect to particular land or structures. And then it goes on to state the variance granting criteria that we've talked about before, that I'll touch on again. So this creates a dynamic that I find very, very difficult to deal with in the various towns that I work, which is that 48 Section 10 says that towns don't have the power to grant use variances unless specifically authorized by their bylaw. And this bylaw specifically authorizes the grant of a use variance. But the variance granting criteria all require that the hardship be tied to either topography, soil condition, or shape, none of which I would contend ever lend themselves to a use situation. Those criteria always dictate where you locate a structure. And the reason why you locate it at the location, either the shape of the lot, the topography of the lot, or the soil condition will dictate that, for example, you can't put a structure somewhere because of ledge under the thing, or an eroding coastal bank, or something like that. So it creates this dynamic that is really difficult for us to deal with as practitioners. And some towns, for example, the city of Boston, have dealt with this by actually in their zoning code identifying specific criteria for granting use variances. We don't have that here. So what that leaves us with is a board that has the authority to grant a use variance, but probably under a very strict literal interpretation of the bylaw, almost never could grant a use variance. So that lends itself, or leads to the dynamic where boards, when they do grant use variances, tend to weight certain factors more than other factors in the consideration of the variance. That's his background. In this particular case,
Before you go on,
Yep.
we have confronted that issue fairly recently, where we had a use variance for a laundromat downtown. And it was very apparent, it was something that should happen, it was in the interest of the town, it was a right thing to do, but we hung our hat on the structure. We claimed that the structure, because it says the hardship is owing to circumstances relating to the soil conditions, shape, or topography of such land, or structures. So we said the structure was built to be a laundromat.
yeah, but that necessarily, and again, I can't envision every scenario that would come up, but that necessarily means that the boards usually are looking a little more leniently at topography, soil condition, and shape, because it's a lot easier for board, for example, to recognize a financial or other hardship to an applicant. And it's certainly much easier for a board to recognize that the granting of the variance won't derogate from the spirit of the intent of the bylaw. In this case, I think not requiring somebody to build a structure certainly won't derogate from the bylaw, because it facilitates less, density and crowding. In this case, the hardship to the applicant, and I've said this before, but the hardship to the applicant is a strict enforcement of the bylaw will require the applicant to build a dwelling, a principal use on this lot, in order to enjoy the lot for the use in connection with the adjacent dwelling they already own. Essentially, they'll have to have 2 dwellings for the use of the swimming pool. That will require, in today's market, some of the members here will know much better than I what the cost of construction are. I think Mr. Cole certainly would, but they're expensive. These applicants want to have a swimming pool for the use in connection with the dwelling that they already own and have owned for decades. For them to go out and build a second dwelling, I don't think it would be out of line to say it would cost them $500,000 to build some type of a dwelling structure, even a small one, maybe a little bit less, but in any event, hundreds of thousands of dollars on top of the cost of building a swimming pool, which is not inconsequential. That could be in the over $100,000 range to build a swimming pool. So that's the hardship to the applicant. The other hardship that they have is that the other alternative they might have would be to merge the two lots. But if the board members recall, I can show the members that are here, but there's actually a way in between the two lots. And it's a roadway, it's a 40-foot wide, private way that the applicants own the way in between the two lots. But they can't merge lots without eliminating that way. And to eliminate that way, they would have to go through a court proceeding to eliminate rights in the way, which means they would have to serve the people on the road. They would assume there would be no objections. I hope there wouldn't be. They would have to go through the process of notifying, get a judgment, record the judgment, and then they would have to come into the planning board and they would have to submit a plan to the planning board to combine the two lots now that the way has been eliminated, and the single lot would get bigger by the width of the way. And then, as the members can note, this is registered land. They would then have to go through a registered land proceeding in which they would have to submit the division plan of land for a pre-filing review. It would have to go through a review by the engineering department. They would have to get approval by the engineering department after doing extensive survey work, under land court survey guidelines. They would then have to go through the planning board process of having the plan approved. Then they would have to send that plan back to the land court and have the land court then approve a revised plan. And that can take well over a year to do. So, it's not as simple, for example, as if this lot were directly abutting the other lot. And I went through and I looked at those 23 or 27 cases that I presented to the board earlier as to how many of those properties actually had something in between the two lots, a roadway or a road. And I found 2 properties in which the other lot that was being used was across away from the property. All the other ones that I looked at, including the 3 that I presented to you last time, the lots were always adjacent to or abutting the lot that the people owned, which makes merger really as simple as filing a statement with the assessor of intent to merge the lots, or pulling a building permit in some way that evidences an intent to abandon your separate lot status. In this case, the applicant would have to go through a very significant and expensive and time-consuming process. What I'm positing to the board here is that hardship of that expense to go through, to do all those things to merge this lot, as well as the loss of the value of the lot, because the lot is worth, according to the assessor, approximately $1 million. That lot would fall from a separately buildable lot worth approximately $1 million to what we call assemblage land, which is just extra yard area, which I can't tell you what extra yard area is worth, but it's significantly less than a separately buildable lot. It's just whatever additional lot area you have for what you can do. So the hardship, I think, is there. The hardship is related to the fact that not only is the lot a separate lot, but it's separated by the roadway. It's separated by this roadway, which prevents them from doing that merger thing to put the lots together. The third leg of the test is, can the relief be granted without substantially derogating from the spirit or the intent of the bylaw? And as I said to you last time, if everybody with a spare lot in Orleans just put a swimming pool on it, or a garage or a tennis court, it would lead to significantly less traffic congestion, visual density, scale, massing, than if people were to build houses on these lots. And finally, as the board has seen, we had letters of support from the Lorinojas, the Hamiltons, the Singers, the Turners, the Schumachers, the Parmeters, the Benitos, and the Gages. That's 8 families that took the time to write to this board and say, we support this project. Now, a couple of them had questions. Hamilton wanted to make sure that it was adequately screened. She wanted to know that if a house were being built, she'd want to know where the house was being built. And I have to say that if the applicant were to build a house on the lot, we wouldn't be in front of this board. It would be a by right construction. As long as the house were constructed to meet the setback requirements and the pool met the setback requirements, there would be no oversight of the house anyways. So I think that even the weight of the abutter letters lends some evidence to the board of 2 things. One, I don't believe there were any objections to this project. That the likelihood of appeal is probably small, if at all. And also that the neighbor support, including the neighbor directly adjacent to 12 Harris Road, is indicative of the fact that this application will not have a detrimental effect on the bylaw with regard to, what it holds to be important. So I'm hopeful that that's sufficient for this board to see fit to grant a variance. And I'll rest my comments there, and thank you.
Well, why don't you talk a little bit about the topography a little bit, or at least
Well-
in your submission, you talk about the fact that it's a dead end and it's
It's,
hard to access, or
well, a couple things. One is, and the members that have been out there may have seen this, when you come up the road, you don't notice the roadway, it's a driveway. The house sits up on the left on the higher ground. The lot, the vacant lot drops off to lower ground. That vacant lot actually provides the view shed from the house out to Town Cove, which is of importance to the applicant. So to put a structure there, to put a house there is going to interfere with their own view shed, let alone the view shed of people, other people in the neighborhood, possibly their neighbors. So the lot does have a lower topography, it slopes away to the north from this roadway, and building on that lot will put a structure, I'm not gonna say they won't do it in the future, but when a structure is built there, it will in some way affect the view of Town Cove. And also, because it's lower, it doesn't lend itself to that same use and as desirably as where the house is now. And that's probably why the family way back when built the house on that lot on the left and didn't develop the lot on the right. So there is definitely a topographical condition there that is unique to this property, or these two properties.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any questions or comments on the presentation?
Just a comment, I'm stuck on the pool as a use. The pool is a structure. How does the pool constitute a use? And if so, what is that use? And where do we find it in the use table?
If I could address that, Mr. Chairman?
Please.
I think Mr. Cole raises a good point. If it's not a use, then it's not prohibited as something that needs to be accessory to a principal use. If it's a structure, and it is a structure, I agree with Mr. Cole, it is a structure. And it is required by the bylaw. The bylaw specifically requires the swimming pools to be set back 10 feet from lot lines. So it's going to be constructed to be conforming to dimensional requirements as a structure. But if it's not a use, and it's not a separate use that's identified, I don't believe, and I tried to get into this at the last meeting, I don't believe that this use rises to the level of the type of activity that would be separately listed in the use tables, like a garage, for example, or if you put a basketball hoop or a garden on your property. I don't think it rises to that level. That's why I don't think it's there. I'm not sure how to handle that, to address Mr. Cole's question, or Matt's question, but, if the board were to find that this were not a use that rose to the level of a use that requires a principal use to use it, I think that backs you into overturning the building inspector, which I think you've indicated you don't want to do.
Well,
So-
why can't we just look at this as a structure? And they're applying for a variance to build a structure on the lot. You took us down the use,
Well,
the road, but I think it's a structure.
but structurally, it's fine. I mean, look, structurally, it's fine. Structurally, it meets all the requirements of the bylaw. It's the use of the swimming pool, it's the fact that it's being used for something that's accessory to a principal use is what's tripping up the building inspector.
Why don't they say this is a primary use now under a variance?
I don't think I would go that far in interpreting the zoning code. I don't think the zoning code permits swimming pools as a primary use. Because then that would be the tail wagging the dog, I believe. I see the swimming pool as a use, not the construction of the pool. The construction of the pool is subject to health regulations and dimensional regulations of the zoning code. I see the use of this swimming pool as a use that is traditionally incidentally used as accessory to a residential use of a property. Assuming this isn't commercial, but that it doesn't rise to the level that would typically have a separate use classification in the zoning code. I'm not sure how that addresses Matt's question. I'm not sure I can address it further than that.
If I may, isn't it that the basic issue here is that our zoning bylaw is not clear? And that's why we have these various options of looking at it, structure, use, etc. So we're trying to make.
Yeah, well, I think the building commissioner thought it was clear, but it was clearly something that wasn't envisioned when the bylaw was written. It isn't that it's unclear, it's just that it wasn't, to my mind, it just wasn't ever considered.
My question related to that is, the variance is providing relief from some provision, some requirement set forth in the bylaws.
Right.
If we were to consider this a use, pools are not allowed, are not specifically identified as primary or accessory use. They're not listed. But I think we'd have the ability to declare that use as a variance. But if the literal enforcement of the provisions is the lack of specificity, like what would the variance actually, there's not a bylaw we're saying we're varying from at that point. It's just not covered.
Well, yeah, we're
We're varying from the bylaw as in
We're
totality.
varying from the bylaw as interpreted by the building commissioner. He said it's a not permitted use on a freestanding lot.
Well, if I could confuse
So
them.
he thinks it's in the bylaw, the prohibition.
But, look, the bylaw in New Orleans is clear, as many towns, uses that are not specifically listed are prohibited. That's what the bylaw says. I don't think this bylaw envisions that swimming pools are prohibited in the town of Orleans. I don't see that, especially where the bylaw has a specific setback requirement for swimming pools. So, I think there may be some middle ground for this board. Instead of saying, we're gonna overturn the building inspector and say that, accessory uses are permitted on vacant lots, generally, maybe you could find that the swimming pool use, in this particular situation, where it's being used as accessory to another lot owned by the same owner in the immediate vicinity, that would be a use that's not a prohibited use under the bylaw. That would certainly create a precedence for people that want to put a swimming pool on an adjacent lot. But it doesn't open the door generally to people just saying, you ruled this way, now I want to put a whatever, a go-kart track, on the vacant lot. I mean, there may be some middle ground there.
Yeah.
I believe in my mind that, for this board to exercise the greatest amount of control over this project, it would be advisable to see fit to grant the variance and impose a condition that the variance is only granted for the purpose of the construction of the swimming pool on the lot for so long as the lot is owned, in common control of the adjacent property. At least then you can impose that condition and get on with it. But the interpretation of the bylaw is just so fraught with so many variables that I have a hard time really getting around.
Yeah, and then the variance concept, as you had described it, Ben, with the road in between the two lots, that does, I know that, we don't look at that particularly. It says shape, topography, soil condition. It's not in there, but it is related to the land and the topography of those two parcels. So there is a difficulty. I could see a financial difficulty there,
Yeah.
a hardship.
Austin?
I figured, just because I wanted to get clarity, I did do a couple searches on topography. Definitions I found were the arrangement of natural and artificial features physical features of an area. So to me, I feel like a road would still be considered part of the topography.
Right.
It's not natural
Artificial.
Topography, but it'd be artificial
Right.
topography. So I think considering that road as being relevant for the topographical nature of the hardship would be relevant in that case.
Right, does it relate to the second,
I think that's my claim is the hardship sounds to be that I guess I'm trying to think of it like if we were to literally enforce the bylaw, which would mean that the accessory use must be on the same property. It would require either the pool to be built on the lot that has a house, the combination of those two lots, which would be financial hardship in multiple ways. And part of that financial hardship would be related to the fact that you have to jump through hoops to figure out how to deal with the road. I don't understand all the ins and outs of that. Or you build another house on the other lot. And all of those carry some financial hardship. Would we consider there to be enough room to build a pool on the lot that they're looking to build? If there's not enough room on that lot to build, that is a hardship owing to the topography.
Yeah, well, I think the
But I
hardship
think
is easy to prove.
But I think what I want to make sure we're clear on is what the variance is actually doing. And it feels like the clearest thing would be to say it's a variance for use in the accessory use part of the schedule of use. And there's a section there specifically for accessory use. Not to say it's primary use on that lot, but to say the accessory use of a pool is acceptable in this case by a variance. And that it's naturally would be on a different lot at that point. So part of the variance would be allowing that multiple lot crossover.
And what would happen, if I may ask, I think we've kind of discussed this before, let's say that they do sell the property. So what kind of,
It would be the same as any other zoning case, then the property would be in violation of zoning. Well, if it were sold and in connection with the sale, the purchaser built a dwelling on the lot, then it would be in conformance with zoning. But if the buyer maintained the swimming pool in the absence of a dwelling, then it would be in violation of zoning like anything else, and this variance is going to be recorded in the registry of deeds, and it will be part of the record title.
so what kind of restriction would we put
We'd
on this
we'd have a
variance?
condition, if we granted a variance, we'd have a condition of the variance that the pool has to be in common ownership with the house, and at such point where it is no longer, there has to be a house on that lot. So the pool is accessory to the new house.
Theoretically, the building inspector could seek a cease and desist. Like any other unlawful use in New Orleans, could come and serve a cease and desist and say you can't use a swimming pool.
And I think if we were to declare it as being, if the variance was to allow pools as accessory use across adjacent lot lines, if they were to sell the main house or sell the pool, that it would then be accessory to nothing. And that would be in violation of zoning by itself. I still would be in favor of having the restrictions to explicitly enforce that, but I think having it listed as an accessory use would cover that in kind of implicitly.
And this is a good case also to, because all cases, we look at them on a case-by-case basis. So this one particularly, doing a variance, I think makes sense because, you know, we looked at all the different options and it's not going to create a precedence, in other words.
No, variances generally don't. But even if someone came back and said to us, well, you gave a variance in this case, it's not the worst thing to happen, I don't think. I mean, we're here because if you own a lot next door to your house, we sort of feel you should be able to build a pool. I don't think it's the worst thing to happen, even if it was used as a precedent.
Right.
But they can't force it. It doesn't become of a right. They have to come in and apply for a variance.
Well, also, I mean, look, if you were to see fit to grant a variance, you're going to be making findings of fact that it's at the end of a dead-end road,
Yeah, right.
that the topography slopes away, that there's full support of the neighbors, and that this particular location lends itself to this particular pool. It's not going to impose itself. If somebody were to come in with a lot next door that's in a crowded neighborhood, let's say somebody had another lot in Grandview and came in and said, I want a swimming pool right there, you may find that the neighborhood characteristics are different such that you don't see that a variance can be granted, because there will be a detriment to the neighborhood in those regards.
We didn't resolve your question, Matt. We've sort of stepped around it,
I don't think we
and trying
can.
to find language around it. But,
Yeah, it's a tricky one. There's no real easy outcome here.
no.
I think we can probably agree there's maybe some proposed revisions to sections and
Well, I think the whole absence of a use standards is a terrible failing of the bylaw. We
I-
had to-
When I was driving over, I stopped at the store to get a couple things for dinner, and I thought to myself, if it weren't May, I would probably try to get 10 signatures and petition the zoning change to just say, you know, you can, to clarify the zoning code, but that's the kind of thing you want to do with the planning office. It's something that I may well pick up and try to work on just personally.
Well, George and I have talked about the problems we have with use variances. So we've already discussed the issue generally.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is you could, without even touching use variances, you could amend the zoning bylaw to put swimming pools as accessory to residential use as a separate use classification, and provide a section that says that, the following accessory uses may be conducted on a lot owned and controlled by You know, if it's in the same, there's a bylaw that you could probably craft. I don't know if it would pass, but,
It's already a carve-out for scientific use, specifically
Yeah,
in
you-
6416.
yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, it would,
Use that for the,
but we're not here with that, and I really hate to put clients' hopes on passing a bylaw, because they never seem to pass, so I'm hoping you see fit to grant.
Lynn, do you have any thoughts?
I don't want to do the special permit because although Council Zender suggested, well, you know, we could put conditions on it and it'll lower density and that's good. But actually, I'm not sure we want to set a precedent where you can put an accessory use on a vacant lot because at least the way the comprehensive plan is evolving in town that I have seen on the planning board, we actually want to grow the population and some density in areas. So I don't think we want people building their playground with tennis courts and pools next door, or if they own a couple lots. I don't think we want that. So I don't like to set that precedent. And I really want to pursue the variance. And I'm not sure I would have heard a good argument, an airtight argument, why we can't pursue the variance with conditions.
Yeah, I think we can. As long as we satisfy ourselves that, I think Austin said it best, that we're giving a variance for a specific use to this unit, to this lot, for a pool.
So it's a use that's not defined, so you're allowing something that's not defined, so I'm just not clear what that variance would,
I think it's,
what's.
would it be the
what-
same
what's
thing as
this-
our storage discussion and the laundromat? Like, the laundromat is not an allowed use per the table, but we found it.
No, it actually is, but not in the village. So
Oh,
we need a variance to get away from
Piece, thank you.
being in the
So
village.
maybe just the special permit,
I,
that we,
No, that was a variance, we got a variance because it was prohibited in the village.
or I was thinking, sorry, the storage we discussed
Oh,
a
the
few weeks
storage,
back,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
where we had proposed, or we had discussed, we hadn't gone fully through it, but we discussed that storage, as specifically defined storage, is not an allowed, there's not a permitted use per the or per the schedule of use table, but we allowed the change, or we proposed the change of use to that because the subject's property was already pre-existing non-conforming,
Yeah.
and we have the ability to change to another intensification, modification of that
I think in this case, I don't believe that a swimming pool is a disallowed use in the town of Orleans. I think the swimming pool, by that, I'm not talking about commercial swimming pools, I'm talking about residential swimming pools. I think they're a use that's a contemplated use under the bylaw, as evidenced by the fact that there are dimensional requirements attached to them. I think they're a contemplated residential accessory use that's not specifically listed in the bylaw. That's the way that I think I would classify it. So I think the variance would be to allow the contemplated residential accessory swimming pool use on a lot absence the principal use of the dwelling in this particular situation based on, the findings that the board makes.
Yeah.
Does that,
Yeah, I'm sure they usually it's or bylaw says you can't do this, and our variance says actually you can. Here it's, the absence and the,
Right.
just the air of, it doesn't say, but it kind of
I think it's a
implies. Yeah.
contemplated residential accessory use. That's the best way I could describe it.
So the variance would be us asserting that accessory use is allowed over lot lines.
In this instance. I
In
think-
this
I
instance,
think,
yes.
I think to pick up on Lynn's point, this is not gonna be presidential.
Yes.
We, first of all, I don't think variances ever are. But we're gonna define this variance, we're gonna define the particular circumstances that led to this variance in a way that it will become impossible to recreate somewhere else, frankly. You described the lot, you described the intervening road, the map road or the private road. You describe the fact there's no other access to this, you can describe the land going off. You can describe the neighborhood being supportive. We could so describe this application so that nobody else could meet it on all fours. Which I think is sort of the general idea for all variances. They're always sort of stand on their own four and not a lot of precedent on variances. Now, you could say we may be establishing a variance for the use as a pool, but again, it's limited to this particular circumstances.
Well, I'm happy to draft a decision for the board to review, although I'm not sure that helps you tonight.
No,
So-
let's see if we can get everybody there. Let me take a pause and attend the process for a minute. Peggy, is there anybody with their hand raised or looking to speak on this?
No hands raised?
No hands raised, thank you. All right. Anybody want to take a stab at a motion? Well, first of all, we ought to vote. Here's what we ought to do. We have to vote, before we can get to the variance, we have to decide whether to uphold the building commissioner or not.
Could you clarify and remind me, because I was a bit confused the last time we went through this.
Yeah.
What is the specific vote we would be doing related to the building commissioner's decision? And what is the required votes? Because I think last time we were voting to reject, and I got triple negatived a little bit, trying to figure out what we were actually voting on and what the requirements were, whether it was
That's why we
3,
took-
2.
That's why we took a break to seek council's
Yeah.
input. I think, now you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's just a majority vote to uphold the
It's-
building commissioner.
It's a supermajority vote to overturn the building
Overturn,
inspector. It requires 4 votes to overturn.
Overturn.
I don't believe it requires 4 votes to uphold the building inspector because
Right.
essentially you're not overturning the building inspector.
Right.
So,
But the vote
So
would
look,
be.
I started out this process thinking that we should uphold the building commissioner, and I think if anything, our zoning code here has shown that it's not perfect and that there's an opportunity to improve it both for our great building commissioner and also for ourselves. I want you to look at 16422G, which again, there's multiple references in the bylaw to pools, so I am compelled to think that, pools are an expected feature, right? We don't regulate bird feeders, we don't regulate mailboxes. G seems to differentiate, so G does a couple things. It sets a horizontal setback requirement for a ground level pool that is different than a building or a structure, right? So the building setback line, which you see on the site plan, is 25 feet. For a ground level pool, it's 10 feet. And then in the last sentence, it seems to differentiate ground level pools from elevated or enclosed swimming pools, which it then goes on to say shall be considered accessory buildings. So sort of digesting all of that, I wonder whether when you have a ground level pool that complies with the 10-foot setback, if this bylaw sees that as, incidental to the residential use, such that it purposefully isn't prohibited. And it's complicated by the fact that there's not a principal structure, sure. I'm not sure that we haven't found, an indication here that ground level swimming pools that comply with the horizontal setback
But that's the
should be allowed without a
complication though.
variance.
Yeah, as you said, the complication is not having a primary structure. It falls back to that again.
Which isn't said anywhere, and again, there was the subject of use, with it nowhere in the use table, again, just like a mailbox isn't a use and a bird feeder isn't a use, a pool, I don't see a pool as a use. There's no recreational facility use under the residential or commercial heading in the use table.
I think Matt's comments bring me kind of back to where I was at the last two meetings. It leaves the board open to, I think, making a more sweeping determination, which may be risky for the board. But if the board finds that under 164-22G, you know, a swimming pool at grade that's not raised is not considered a building and is also considered to be an accessory use that's not required to be on the same lot with the principal use, you could overturn the building inspector in that regard, and the applicant could go ahead and build their pool. You wouldn't be able to condition it in any way. So,
I am a little surprised going through this, there's not ways to, we don't have the power to modify, like, you know, like I think by the letter, I think by the intent, I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. I support the project, it's just a matter of how it gets implemented. But I think it's reasonable to say, like Davis's comment, if we were talking about two lots that were on opposite sides of town, I think we'd all be in agreement, one lot would not be accessory to the other. In the cases where they are contiguous, or effectively contiguous here with the road, but adjoining lots in common ownership, it's like, we don't have the power to add clarity to the decision. It's just, by us overturning, we're just saying that email never happened. Like, it feels like we should have, like, we're being put in this position where we either have to say it's de facto okay, because I think, you know, it being accessory doesn't, if we were to overturn it as is, nothing's stopping somebody from just saying that a use is accessory across town. Like, I think it has implications far outside of just this one type of case where you have an adjacent property. It doesn't even say you have to be, it can be adjacent to your neighbor's house, or accessory to your neighbor's house. So I think the fact we don't have that power, I think, in my mind, forces us to go with a variance. But if Davis had slightly reworded or added it's unacceptable unless if they're attached.
If I could, I'd like to read to you from 48, section 14, which surprised me a little bit, and Jerry, and you're saying that Mike said you can do anything. Board of Appeals shall have the following powers. One is to hear and decide appeals to the decisions of a zoning administrator, and then it says, in exercising the powers granted by this section, a Board of Appeals may, in conformity with the provisions of this chapter, make orders or decisions, reverse or affirm in whole or in part, or modify any order or decision. And to that end, it shall have all the powers of the officer from whom the appeal is taken. So I think this board has the power to.
He said we had the power to do.
Yeah, so I think
guess
you could
preferential
modify his order and say where.
Well, I think his point was he thinks modifying the order by allowing the swimming pool is overturning his order.
I don't believe so. I think you can modify, you can overturn in part, you can affirm in part. You could affirm his determination that an accessory use is not allowable, a listed accessory use is not allowable on a lot absent of principal use. You could say that. But then you could say you could overturn his determination insofar as a residential swimming pool that is not elevated above ground is permitted on a lot in common control with the applicant, you know, provided they're in common control. You could, and that would limit that decision to this particular situation with the swimming pool, specifically because 22G talks about swimming
Yeah,
pools.
but it wouldn't,
It wouldn't.
because then he would, then we're telling him that if he has another project, he could basically approve it without
He would
sending
have
it
to,
to
as a
us.
matter of right.
Well,
If we said that he's wrong about unenclosed swimming pools at the level than anybody else in a,
With an unenclosed swimming pool at the level in a lot in common ownership,
right.
which I think would be, first of all, would be a relatively small subsection. But all I'm saying is, I think you have the power, if you want, to modify his decision in part. You don't have to just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, you know, we're gonna dismiss.
Well, then you get, okay, they can do it, but then we lose the ability to put conditions on it.
Well, no, you could modify his decision to say that insofar as this lot is owned in common control with another lot in the immediate vicinity, and insofar as this is an in-ground swimming pool that doesn't constitute a building, that he is overturned and that this activity is permitted. You could condition it in that way. It wouldn't be a conditioned permit, but it would be a conditioned approval that would inform the building inspector and
Yeah, but I mean,
legally.
we're talking about then, we have no control over keeping it joined with the present house.
Oh, yes, you do, because when you've modified the decision in that regard, then that becomes the law with regard to this project. And that means that insofar as somebody then either deeds it out of common control, because that's part of your order, then the building inspector has the authority to say, okay, now you're in violation of my order as modified by the zoning board, and I'm gonna give you a cease and desist order.
And you file that with the registry?
We'd be happy to do that. We could certainly file that with the registry. I'm just saying, again, I'm not suggesting the better way for you to do it. I'm just saying the statement that that you have to just overturn the building inspector is incorrect. You can modify it and condition that overturning. And then, if you want to make that a condition of recording, we're happy to do that, but.
Well, when we last talked about, overturning building inspector's decision, he had made 5 granted bulleted points, and we voted on each of those individually.
Right.
So, just looking through, I'm just gonna read his original email.
Yeah.
My interpretation of the bylaw is that an accessory structure, including an in-ground swimming pool, cannot be allowed by right on a lot if there is no primary structure dwelling unit located on said lot to which it is accessory. Nor can an accessory structure be accessory to a primary dwelling unit on a nearby or adjacent lot, even if the lots are in common ownership. If we were to overturn that and specify that the last sentence, instead of being even if the lots are in common ownership, to unless, our disagreement is the common ownership, solely the common ownership portion of that an accessory structure can be allowed, provided they are in common ownership. So that's that section. Like the first section can't be allowed by right. The whole thing just hinges on that last section of even if the lots are in common ownership. And that's the one part I think we'd want to be overturning. Because that would, it would align with, it doesn't allow you to, the adjacent lots that are not in common ownership or common ownership that aren't adjacent lots wouldn't be able to do this. But if you
Well,
have,
you can't get past the first clause, the second clause. My interpretation of the bylaw is an accessory structure, including in-ground swimming pool, cannot be allowed by right on a lot if there's no primary structure. I think it's on to say, even if the lots are commonly owned, we could say, I guess, you need it on a, yeah, I guess we could do that. I think you're right.
I think it's just our disagreement is,
The common ownership changes it.
yeah. And so if at some point they were no longer in common ownership, it would now be in violation of the bylaws.
It's a simple solution,
I
but it's more, so the conditioning that you're imposing is the condition in your decision is that they have to be, the lot has to be in common, and I would ask that it be in common control, not common ownership, because it may be that they own, the families could, but they would have to be in common control, so, but,
Oh, you mean if they build a house for their son or daughter?
well, if they build a house with the son or the daughter, they're fine, but they could, maybe for, common ownership's fine, but.
But we also asked town council for his recommendation.
Well,
And it seemed like
he thought it was simple and easy.
to do a
I'm
variance.
putting words in his mouth, he'd deny it if he were here. But the variance is, if you can hang your hat on you can find grounds for the second criteria for a variance, it's simpler and easier.
Right.
You can do anything under a variance.
I believe the variance allows this board to have more control over.
That's right, it does.
I disagree. I mean, look, if the board has been given a
Well, it's
decision.
clean
building
and simple. You go to the registry and you see a variance and a condition on a variance. You say, what is this, a building commissioner, what is this? What is it? Some poor title examiner's gonna say, what the hell is this?
Yeah, I think modifying a building inspector's determination is one of the things that boards do. You don't do it very often, so it's a little more foreign, but it's certainly a simpler solution. You don't have to make, you certainly don't have to make findings of fact with regard to topography and soil condition and shape and, but, frankly, from my client's perspective, we don't care how you get there. If you would rather do a variance and not make any changes to the interpretation of the bylaw, we're okay with that.
Well, let me suggest, in the interest of moving this forward, getting some progress here at the meeting, I would suggest that we take up a motion made by Austin, as he just described it, which would be to uphold the building commissioner's decision, except when it got down to the last clause, if the lots are in common ownership, even if. And say that we uphold his decision regarding every other lot in town, but when you have common ownership, we'll allow it above.
So Jerry, does
Yeah.
that set a precedent that any lot in common ownership then can put a pool on a separate lot where they don't have a primary dwelling?
I think it does.
Yeah, I would assume
It does, and
Yeah.
I don't,
Well, let me.
I really don't wanna set that precedent.
Let me raise this issue, though, and I think it's appropriate for us to take into account economics or financial considerations. At some point, you have a lot in this town, a buildable lot in this town, which is worth, and you're wasting it on a pool. At some point, I think people are gonna, I don't think that's gonna be very attractive. I think inevitably, there'll be a house built on every buildable lot here. Just the finances are gonna argue against $1 million lot, and you've got a 10-foot swimming pool. It's crazy, you know. Same goes with tennis courts.
I think the safer course of conduct for this board, although legally, I think the overturning the building inspector and part modifying is what I would consider to be a more legally correct thing to do. I think the safer course of action to address the members' concerns about precedence would be just to move the granting of a variance. And then, I'm happy to work with the board on establishing those findings of fact, working through those. I need 4 votes here, so,
Yeah, I know. I think,
I just wanted to add again that most of the lots that are developable in town that are not down, in the downtown area, most buildings we can build out are in the downtown area, in the Seward area. But there's roughly 600 lots that you could build in residential areas, and many of them include several lots in common ownership that have passed down through the families. This is what I was told by George, Jerry.
yeah,
And when we're talking about, the plans, and the plans for the future. And so I again remain concerned that, and in terms of financial wherewithal, a lot of people have plenty of financial means, and I'm watching in my neighborhood recreational pleasure things being built all over the place. So I don't think we'd be setting a precedent that wouldn't become an issue. And again, I think where the town is going is to try to seek population growth and more density, not less.
in my neighborhood, all the lots are being given to conservation, which is a whole another whole bag of worms. All right, I think we ought to get some sense of the board, is it fair to say that we all want to allow them to do the pool? Is there anybody who doesn't want to allow the pool to be built? I think all we're talking about tonight is how do we do it, okay?
Yeah, I think it's obvious in the case of this that if a pool were not built, they will not be selling this property to build, for somebody else to build a home to have kids go through our elementary school system.
If you went to the property, the lot is
Yeah, it's,
part of the property, I mean, they're not big lots.
I think, Lynn, I see your point. I don't know the numbers, but I can see how there could be, it could be an upset if folks decided this is what they wanted to do. with their adjoining common ownership lots. I think I'm happy to go forward with the variance. I think just getting, maybe more explicit clarity on, B, the owing to the soil conditions, shape, or topography. I think there's a case for it. I just want to make sure we're all aligned on what that case is.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Again,
So
I
Bill,
think,
what are your thoughts?
I believe we should approve a swimming pool here, and in my point of view, I could see the special permit, but I believe the variance is the better way to go.
Matt, what are your thoughts?
So, a pool is not a use, a ground level pool that's not elevated is not an accessory building. With those two beliefs, facts, and also not being convinced on the variance criteria, I'm a no on the variance. I want to see a way to do this, and I like a solution that includes something recorded to the property, as we talked about last meeting. So again, I think 22G helps us to separate and not define this as an accessory building.
Yeah.
Matt, can I ask you a question? Because I may be not understanding where you're going. So if we did what you suggest, then anybody who has a lot that's common ownership that doesn't have a primary dwelling could put a pool on it, right?
If it conforms to setbacks and it's flush to the ground, correct. And so I think the onus is then on us to decide, and the building commissioner, to decide whether we think this is a flaw in the zoning code and something that we should take up modifying. And that we or the building commissioner would be the champion of that, and not, a single applicant looking to, change a zoning code for their one and only project.
Or if we, let's say people want to change the zoning code and make it clear that you don't put an accessory dwelling, or don't put a pool. A pool is an accessory use, and we don't want it on a separate lot that doesn't have a primary building. If that's where we want to go with zoning, then what does this decision do then? It's
I think it kicks off the discussion of us, one way or another, codifying this into zoning. Feels like this should be something that should be approvable on a special permit basis.
so.
But that's
so
not
what
how
you're
it's
saying
currently
is
written.
change the zoning law so that you don't set the precedent. But in this case, given the current zoning law, this is what we find.
I think that's right. And again, I appreciate the differentiation that last sentence provides, right? If I don't like my neighbor and I want a tennis court and I put some platform tennis 10 feet up in the air to block their view, or that would block their view, this prevents me from doing that by right. It's an accessory building at that point. It's got to meet a whole different criteria. But something sitting flush with the ground is handled differently. And I think that's appropriate, that those two very different scenarios should be treated differently.
But this may also not be flush with the ground because the terrain slopes. One part of the pool may have to be above ground.
Well, except that it wouldn't block anyone's view.
Unless you see the surrounding, gate that you put up as blocking your neighbor's view.
I don't read this bylaw as saying that a pool that, for example, has a grade change on one side is an elevated pool. I read it as being an above, we think of above ground swimming pools as structures that are purposely built to exist above the ground. But, that's up to the board to determine, but.
Yeah,
I think that's a great point, Sabal, and something that should be, clarified in whatever the decision is, whether it's a condition on the variance or it's part of our memo back to the building commissioner. I think that's,
Well, if you-
G differentiates and we should too.
Yeah, this particular lot, there's nobody's view that's going to be impacted except the owner's view. If you went to the lot, you'd see it slopes down, there's nobody, they're the highest point. There's nobody's view is gonna be impacted by this pool, except the owners. Well, we need 4 votes either way. And Lynn, you're opposed to the building, upholding the building commissioner with the exception of that last phrase.
Would
Okay,
rather not.
all right. Is there anyone in the same boat as Lynn? I'm easily swayed by either one. I could vote for either one of these. I think they're both appropriate solutions to the problem.
I think I'm leaning more, as we've talked about a little more in the last few minutes, I'm leaning more towards modification or overturning the building commissioner's position. I think it would be prudent of us, especially maybe Lynn, this is something you could bring up with some of the folks you've been talking to about, I think this is something that should be codified in one way or another in the zoning. I think it's very clear that there's a gap in zoning. And I would love to see this be more prescriptive, and I would love people to use this town in ways that are, productive and in good faith. And I think this is clearly something in that way. So being able to do that in the future, on a case-by-case basis likely, is something I would welcome. But I think overturning this or modifying this, which will probably start a clock to do that, would not be the worst thing in the world. As it stands, right now his email is that his interpretation is that accessory structure cannot be allowed if there's no primary structure on that lot. I guess I disagree with that because I think if the lot's in common ownership, that would be reasonable.
But nowhere does it refer to common ownership.
No,
So then what are we overturning? What he's looking at is, he's looking at our bylaws as the Bible, and he's reading it as the Bible. He's not making an interpretation. We're making that interpretation by saying unless.
I think as I'm going through, you make a fair point. There's nothing in the bylaw that says something about common ownership with accessory use. I think what the clarification or the overturning would be is the accessory structure, nor can an accessory structure be accessory to a primary dwelling unit on a nearby or adjacent lot. That specifically is not specified anywhere in the zoning bylaw.
All right,
So we're saying that I disagree that it can't be accessory on an adjacent lot, regardless of common ownership at that point. But I think specifying common ownership,
what we're saying basically is that if it's on an adjoining lot in common ownership, it isn't prohibited.
I'm going to say not even with common ownership, because Sabel makes a point that common ownership is not listed as an explicit requirement or prohibition in zoning. But zoning, what I'm specifically calling out is that the accessory structure must be accessory, or cannot be accessory on an adjacent lot.
Right, and we're saying it can be.
And I think it's implied that, and I think Davis would be able to still rule on, if we were to say that you can, we overturn this, and by that, I think we'd be saying that you can have a use accessory on a different lot. If somebody were to try and do something and say, use somebody else's property and be accessory to that, I think Davis would be able to step in and say, that's not allowed. And then we would, I assume, uphold that decision.
But then if there's a different inspector and Davis is not around and this gets lost in the shuffle, nobody knows about that.
Well,
But
I think- I think
if someone were into the future rule this same way, we could we can clarify that we've already
Because then
established
what we're
this.
trying to do is we're overturning him, thinking that we're going to somehow change the bylaws to make it clear. But if it doesn't pass, and now what happens to this decision, it's just basically, you're creating, the precedence is the part that I don't like. I think the variance makes it less of a precedence, and I like that the most.
Okay, if we went the variance route, would you be opposed to that, Austin?
I would be in support of either. I think my preference is still the modification or overturning of the building inspector.
Because I don't have a problem overturning building inspectors, that happens all the time. But in this particular case, I can't, find a way of saying he was wrong and that we could justify why he was wrong.
If I could suggest, what I could suggest is if someone were to make a motion that the building inspector's determination is affirmed in part and modified in part. It's affirmed that an accessory structure is not allowed by right on a parcel of land in Orleans absent of principal use. It's modified in part that under 164.22G, which doesn't regulate in-ground swimming pools as buildings, in this particular instance, where the in-ground swimming pool is being used in connection with an adjacent property in common ownership, that it is accessory to the principal dwelling use of the adjacent property. It needs modified and overturned in part. I understand that legally, again, it suffers from some deficiencies, as with the variance. But would
But
it
then you have to come back to us to show us that it is in-ground, and it's not gonna be above.
Well,
ground. And then what's the definition of in-ground? A foot, 4 feet?
Yeah, I would read an in-ground swimming pool as being a swimming pool that is flush with grade at some point along its installation, meaning as opposed to something that's elevated above the existing grade. So, but I'm not, expert enough to make that determination, and the bylaw doesn't say, but I read an in-ground pool as traditionally a pool that you walk up to and you step down into. As
You
opposed
dig
to
to create.
As opposed to a swimming pool you walk up to and you get a ladder or a deck or something to get into, but again, I'll leave that to the board, but either way, you're gonna lose a vote, on this, so.
Right.
Yeah, I think for the, separating out like what Mr. Zender had specified, I think what I would be proposing is the rejection of an accessory structure cannot be allowed by right on a lot if there's no primary structure dwelling unit on said lot. And the clarification would be that the accessory structure would be could be accessory to a primary dwelling on a nearby or adjacent lot in common ownership.
I think of adjacent, not nearby, adjacent lot.
I think striking nearby. I think adjacent
Yeah.
would be the prudent
All
wording
right,
there.
All right. So now we have, all right, so Matt, you would oppose the variance. Lynn, you would oppose overturning the building commissioner.
Yeah, modifying the building commissioner's ruling, yeah.
All right.
I don't,
My slight preference is also to overturn the building commissioner. But I'd like to see this done, and I think that either one, the simplest one is variance, but I think the more accurate one is simplest to do, because is the variance. But I think the more accurate one is the building commissioners. Because I would, anyway. So, you take either one, Austin?
And again, sorry to clarify, the vote here, do we need to first overturn it and then modify it, or is it all in one?
No, that'll be
Say.
one vote.
You'll vote
To uphold it with the following modification.
Now, upholding with a modification, how many votes does that require?
4.
Because normally upholding would just require 2.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer.
I would recommend you do it as a single motion, and you carry it with at least 4 votes to eliminate any questions.
I think that's practically, I'm just curious, like legally, if we have any obligation one way or
Well,
another.
yeah, in the sense that, yeah. I'd like to do 4, I'd like to get 4 votes on one of these.
Yeah.
So Mel, where are you on the, if we did it as a modification of the building commission?
I think variance is the better way to go, but, you know, I'm also someone who likes to go with the general board and
Yeah.
make a decision, so if it's the modification, I'll go with that too.
All right. Well then, why don't we do that? Why don't we entertain a motion? Let's try to get the motion here, Austin.
I move to uphold the building commissioner's decision with the modifications that an accessory structure is allowed by right on a lot if there is no primary structure or dwelling unit located on said lot, which will be accessory. So long as it is adjacent to a lot that contains a primary dwelling unit
In common
in common
ownership.
ownership. I think that's implied, but yes, in common
Yeah,
ownership.
Okay. Now, do we want to, let's just get this vote and then see if we want to put
Well, I would,
conditions on.
one thing, in this particular case, the lot is across a paper road,
Yeah,
so I would ask that the motion say, in this particular matter, the lot is considered to be adjacent as it is adjacent across a paper road.
yes.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
I think I'll amend my movement with the clarification that this lot is considered adjacent,
All right,
considered to be adjacent despite the paper road between.
all right.
So I'm gonna second that, just so we can get into discussion. Again, not looking to belabor this, Austin, very nice job on the motion. I think the one thing I wanna point out is that I think you're and maybe it's intentional, is that you're, in clarifying, you're actually creating a wider berth here than I was perhaps intending by opening this to all accessory structures. Again, my contention is that G provides that a swimming pool at grade is not an accessory building. And so again, I would suggest just tweaking the motion to exclude accessory structure, because again, I would put forth that a pool at grade is not an accessory building.
Is there a specific wording you would feel would define a pool better? Because like in my mind, I keep going to accessory use. I think we've talked about it not being a use and being part and parcel.
Yeah, so part of this is that we're limited because we're discovering the bylaw is limited. G refers to it as a recreational facility, so ground level tennis, unenclosed ground level swimming pool. So again, we could simply say an unenclosed ground level swimming pool if we want to frame this as narrowly as we want, or we could say a recreational facility. But I think if we refer to it as an accessory structure, we're giving it a status that it doesn't have.
I think that's fair.
So are we saying, we're saying that an unenclosed ground level swimming pool is not an accessory structure,
It's not an accessory building, correct?
accessory building, accessory structure, well, structure.
Yeah, is
So it could be
accessory
built
structure
anywhere.
specifically noted in the bylaws? Or is that, because that was the word, accessory structure, including an in-ground swimming pool is what Davis had originally referred to it as. So that was just going by his original. I mean, I think I'd be happy to say that, just striking, interpretation of the bylaw is that an in-ground swimming pool can be allowed by right, or can be allowed by right if there's no primary structure or dwelling unit located on said lot. But it can be accessory to a primary dwelling unit on a nearby or adjacent lot. So I think just stripping out the wording of accessory structure and clarifying that an in-ground swimming pool.
But don't say nearby.
Sorry, I keep reading this word, I'll block it out.
Well, no, when Matt is saying it's not an accessory structure.
I would prefer that structure or building be not included so that we're not giving it that status that I don't think it has. I think G clarifies that by
Would you still consider it, and maybe it's just pedantic, but would you still consider it to be accessory? It's accessory to the house?
It's not a building and it's not a use, it's an accessory what?
Yeah, that's the problem is,
I think you're right, I just don't know.
because in here it
Just say
says it's,
accessory and clean it up later with a bylaw revision, I think that's the best outcome. So totally fine with accessory as long as we don't use building or structure.
So are we saying, is the impact on that you can build anyone can build by right, can build an underground, in-ground pool on an adjoining lot in common ownership? We are saying that.
I think, yeah, for a swimming pool
Right.
specifically, but not generally for accessory buildings or structures.
So then do we have to say it's not, so
Because
then
we're saying that the pool is
It's not
part
an
and
accessory.
parcel of,
we're saying it's not an
house.
accessory structure, basically. But it's not an accessory structure, it's not a accessory structure only when the lot is in common ownership? And if it's not in common ownership, it is an accessory structure? Maybe we gotta go back to the variance.
Yeah, see, it's so confusing that,
If I could suggest,
Yeah.
I think to go to Matt's idea, you could affirm the building inspector's determination that an accessory use is not permitted on a lot absent a principal use. However, in this instance, under 16422G, the proposed at-grade swimming pool does not constitute a separate use that is prohibited on an adjacent lot when used with an adjacent lot in common ownership. I know I'm splitting hairs, but I think I'm trying to get what Matt was saying.
is the disagreement here from the building commissioner that this is an accessory structure, accessory use? And that by us saying this
Yes.
swimming pool is
What
not
he's saying-
accessory use?
What he's saying is that this is an accessory use that has to be located on the same lot with the principal use. What I'm suggesting is that under 22G, where it differentiates in-ground swimming pools, that is not a use that is separately prohibited on a lot, as long as it's being used accessory to an adjacent lot in common ownership. I'm trying to cut this as fine as possible to address Matt's concerns.
So, yeah, all right, I understand that, I think that's good, but what's the impact on a freestanding lot not common? Can I build a pool? It's not an accessory structure.
But I think if all you had was a pool on a lot and there was nothing else there, that would be the primary use of that lot. And a pool by
Yes,
itself
that would be the primary use.
would now be the primary use. The
Got it.
primary use of these
Yeah.
lots is,
And I'm happy to, and again, I'm happy to,
is.
not trying to dictate what the board says, but I'm happy to frame this out in terms of a decision that you can then circulate among the members and come back and have you.
All right, now, we want a condition upon this being, well, does that take care of it? If it has to be, we maybe don't have to do anything. If it has to be, it can only be used if it's in common ownership.
The house were sold, if that lot with only a
That'd be
pool
a
on it
violation of
sold.
zoning based on the building inspector's determination as modified by this board. And again, if the board wants to ask me to record the decision, I'm happy to, and marginally reference it. I can't. I don't think it has an additional legal import, but it certainly puts a buyer on notice that you can't just
Right.
buy a lot, so.
and you cannot,
there's
so
value
if
in
I
that.
have, and this also means that if I have a lot, and because I'm building a pool that's in ground, I could do by right regardless?
No, the pool would still have to be accessory to the principal dwelling use of an adjacent lot.
Adjacent lot.
Yeah.
Is the modification here as simple as just removing, including an in-ground swimming pool?
I think you have to give the building inspector some explanation.
Yeah. Why don't we do this? Why don't we take our vote, and we'll circulate some language?
What's our,
Yeah, what-
yeah,
What's the
maybe I could-
wording here?
I will draw my original, motion.
We all know what we want to do. We want to sit here and try to work it out. We just say that if it's in a nearby, well, we agree that if it's in a nearby, if it's an adjacent lot under common ownership, it does not rise to the level of being in an accessory use. It's just part of the use of the property.
It's well said.
All right?
Just thinking of the right way to word that.
Yeah, well, we'll take it, we can sit here all night and let me, I'll work with council and we'll try to come up with some language and I'll circulate it before we even put it in the decision.
Sounds
Okay?
good.
Because, I mean, look, we're okay if you want to continue this matter, you know, to have something that you can vote on. I mean, you're meeting again in a couple of weeks.
Can we vote based upon the motion that's before us, but conditioned upon final language to be circulated?
Yes,
I hate to continue this again and go back.
yeah, I don't want to, I think we spent enough
Yeah, I
time
think
on
I
this.
too.
Thank you.
More than it deserves. I think I'll take that as a motion, Matt, that we vote on this as we understand it, and then we'll have this is a preliminary vote to authorize me to work on some language with council and to circulate it for the board for final approval. How does that sound?
Perfect.
All right, you want to make that motion, Austin, you want to second it?
So moved.
Second.
All right, great. Let's have a vote. Sibel,
Yes.
Austin,
Yes.
I'm yes. Matt,
Yes.
Lynn,
No,
Thank you all for your time. This was a tough one. Okay, I will, I'll circulate back to the chair, proposed decision with language.
At this point, I need to really thank Lynn for coming tonight. I asked you to come because I was worried that we
Thank you.
wouldn't have four people there. And I fully appreciate your
it was
concern.
fun.
I think the issue is, there's a few things, I think you know this. We found a few holes in the code. We need to sit down with George and talk about making some amendments to this code, including the use provision, which
Yeah, I've
is
got
high
a
up on
couple
my
of
list.
those, so.
So Jerry, you and I have some work to do on the zoning board task force.
Yes, yeah, we do. And maybe we should have a meeting at the end of some meeting to talk about what things like, maybe soon.
Maybe after town meeting on Monday.
Upcoming town, next upcoming meeting, where we don't have much on the agenda, let's put time to talk about suggested changes for the code. All right?
I have a couple I can bring.
Thank you all very much, Lynn, especially
Thank you, Matt.
thank
Thank
you. I
you,
know
Lynn.
it was a nuisance for you to come tonight. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
To adjourn.
Off the bus, Bill.
Thank you. Yeah, move to adjourn. All in
Yes,
favor, any opposed?
yes.
Peggy, are you still there?